Where do you draw the line between rules that are strong, rules that are overpowered, and rules that are broken? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd just do a short discussion video on a bunch of terms that are thrown around quite a lot whenever Games Workshop comes out with models and rules that just happen to be slightly stronger than the versions in the previous codex or army book. I think a lot of the time people just use these three as synonyms for each other, when actually to me I feel that they do represent quite different things. In particular, I define overpowered and broken as really quite different things, whereas a lot of the time I see people just using the words pretty much interchangeably. Just for a short fun video, I thought we'd go through each, talk about how they relate to Warhammer 40K, and maybe a few examples of the units in the current game. So first up we have units and rules that I'd call strong. Maybe some of the staple picks in each army, units that usually get the job done, but maybe not the kind of unit that would just get maximally spammed within an army, and people take as many copies of it as they possibly could. With complicated games like Warhammer 40K, even for a company that was balancing things significantly better than Games Workshop, there will almost always tend to be options and choices that are stronger than other ones, and it's kind of a hard thing to avoid with so many different factions, and the complexity and synergy of rules overlapping with each other. I feel like Games Workshop's design philosophy at the moment is generally to try and make each choice within the codex at least viable in some way, and I'd argue that through the 9th edition codexes they've been doing at least fairly well with that. The majority of choices do seem to have a point. Perhaps the ones that get left by the wayside the most are certain vehicles and things without the core keyword. In any case, I generally call units that are strong but not overpowered the ones that are good picks for doing their jobs within the army, without making any other options redundant, and without being head and shoulders better than other options from other codexes. Perhaps a good example in the current game of 40k might be Space Marine Intercessors, a solid all-round battle line troop, fairly tough for the points with objectives secured, can help to fill out detachments, and a bit of general purpose range and melee damage output, meaning that they're quite flexible. But say compared with other options in the codex, they're not going to do anywhere near as much damage for the point compared with other choices, say like Eradicators or Blade Guard veterans. For the Drakari, maybe you could look at the Ravager, a solid gunline vehicle without the core keyword, spits out a decent amount of firepower to justify itself, without maybe getting to the ludicrous levels of firepower that you could get with stacked and layered buffs. For the Death Guard, perhaps the Feated Bloat Drone might be a solid option. Particularly equipped with the Flesh Mower, it can fill a nice role in the army, a fairly fast-moving melee threat, and moving around spreading contagions of Nurgle, but doesn't quite have the raw damage and defense to be spammed 3 of them in every single list. You likely might want 1 or 2, but not to go absolutely crazy on them, as there's other options and other battlefield roles that you want to fill. I think the ideal state of game balance for Warhammer 40k will be to try and get as many units as possible in this category, where they're perfectly viable within armies, and aren't so weak that you'd not really want to take them, or so strong that they start to cast shadows over other units that would basically do the same thing but worse. Talking of that, that's how I generally understand units that are overpowered to be, and you could describe them as overpowered, too strong, or undercosted. Generally I'd say this applies to models and rules that are so good that they're near auto-include within their codexes, or maybe things like chapter tactics. Say when you have one chapter tactic within the codex that just casts shadows over the others because it's so much better, I think you could argue that that one's overpowered and it reduces army diversity by making it the clear obvious choice. I think you could perhaps be overpowered within your codex and also overpowered within the whole game as a whole. Say if you just have a unit that's far more efficient compared with similar choices in the vast majority of other codexes. Generally having OP units just isn't a good thing for the game in general, as it's likely to create a fair amount of bad feeling if you just line up a bunch of units on the other side of the table to your opponent, and they just do flatly the same thing better than the units in the other person's decks. I'm not really saying that armies shouldn't have some strengths and weaknesses, but there gets to be a bit of a tipping point where if one unit is just so blatantly outclassed by another, it can create some bad feeling. I think for a good example of overpowered in the current state of 40k right now, the Admech Iron Striders are certainly a very easy target for this. For their very small points cost, they just bring far more shooting, mobility and durability than the vast majority of other units for their points. In particular, their shooting damage output really is the thing that sets them apart, but if they were incredibly flimsy or really not able to maneuver well, then it might offset that crazy firepower somewhat. Sticking with the Admech, I think you could certainly argue the same applies to the Skitarii infantry. Rangers and Vanguard have just very good stats for what you pay, Just say if you compare their shooting and durability to the likes of Fire Warriors or Space Marine Intercessors, they'll generally come out on top. Maybe some other good examples might be the Drukhari Raiders and Melee combo. I know the Raiders went up in points a bit lately, but still the vast majority of armies are going to struggle to match that efficiency and mobility that those units can provide. I think perhaps you could maybe make the same claim of Dark Angel's Deathwing Terminators as well. Perhaps within the context of the Greater Space Marine Codex, if you're going to run Terminators, it's very frequently going to make sense to run them as Dark Angels, as they get that enormous durability buff included for free, and also get very easy access to the Objective Secured special rule. Generally, I describe these units as overpowered, though not necessarily broken. I'd say for units that are overpowered, they're the sort of units that are quite easy to fix and rebalance if Games Workshop makes some tweaks. The Admech Iron Striders could be absolutely fine in their current state if you just raise the points on them significantly. The rules are fine, they just need to be pointed appropriately for having that crazy amount of firepower and the core keyword. I think the same is true of Space Marine Eradicators. They were oppressively strong, and now they've been nerfed, at least they're a fair bit more reasonable than they were. Still very strong, but no longer quite as crazily overpowered as they used to be. It wouldn't necessarily have to be changed in points changes, you could maybe nerf damage or durability as well. Say if they made an errata to make Iron Striders go to a 4+ save again, or made their guns hit not quite as hard. For me, overpowered versus broken is largely just whether or not the unit is crazy good for its points cost, as opposed to being something fundamentally wrong with the rules. Finally, that brings us to models and options that are broken within Warhammer 40k, which I feel is a word that is maybe just bandied around a little bit too often, and I prefer to use it quite sparingly, usually applying to rules, mechanics and options that significantly alter the way that the game is normally played, create silly situations like units being invincible, or maybe combo in a very silly and unexpected way with other choices, often in a way that the game's designers almost certainly didn't intend for when they wrote the rule. Very overpowered units can certainly make the game feel bad, but broken units might be even worse. I feel like it's one thing to be heftily outshot by another army, maybe another thing to say never be able to target one enemy unit, or have them just regenerate extra models at a crazy speed that makes the army impossible to ever deal with. 40k has certainly had its share of broken rules throughout the editions, and here are a few of them. It might be worth making a whole video on them at some time, so if you have any other examples of broken rules, please let me know down in the comments. Perhaps one of the most recent examples was the Taraxi stratagem for Admech. Games Workshop recently fixed it in an FAQ, but it was the one that basically allowed them to jump back into the sky at the end of every turn. So essentially they could deep strike, unload a whole load of flamer damage, and then jump back off the board with a stratagem for 1 CP, so they would literally never be exposed to your opponent being able to shoot them in their own turn. Basically an invincible unit, something that doesn't really exist in the rest of 40k, and one thing that I'd label broken. There's plenty of other good examples though. I felt like the Ynnari Soulburst and Sisters Acts of Faith from 8th edition, both of those allowed actions outside the normal sequence of events, and could easily allow you to double the firepower on a unit, or gain a crazy amount of movement, allowing you to hit one unit and then jump away to guaranteed safety. In early 8th you could make a Plague Blossom style list. 8th edition Poxwalkers could reanimate any casualties that fell nearby, and that included other friendly allied Chaos Cultists. You could make Poxwalkers untargetable with a stratagem, pack all the cultists in close, so whatever your opponent shot at, they'd essentially be just creating more Poxwalkers, and kind of upgrading those cultists into a new and stronger form. A more recent example might be the Drukhari Succubus with Razor Flails and Competitive Edge, the weird rules interaction that allows you to double the attacks and then double them again, theoretically giving you up to a maximum of 42 attacks and blending most targets in a single turn on a 60-point model. And going back a long way, there was the Lash of Submission Demon Princes from 3rd edition Chaos Space Marines, one of the few mechanics that allow you to move your opponent's models, and this could create some crazy problems for them. You could just move enemy models straight off objectives, or perhaps just bunch them up nice and tight and then land a Vindicator Pyreplate template on them, kind of breaking one of the standard rules of the game that you're allowed to move your models and your opponent isn't. Not too surprising to see why Games Workshop doesn't have any mechanics like that in the current form of the game. Generally, for things that I'd consider broken, I'd say they're the things that aren't really going to be easily fixed with a points change. For the Admech Taraxi example, sure you could increase the cost of the Taraxi a little bit, then you basically just never seen them used normally, and the only viable way of using them would be to exploit that invincibility loophole. At the moment though, I would say that Games Workshop tends to be quite good at stamping out these loopholes. They're often quite good targets for the 2-week FAQ following the Codex, which is definitely an improvement on what used to happen in 6th edition and before, where they just basically used to ignore them and move on to the next book. So anyway, that's how I describe strong versus overpowered and broken in Warhammer 40k. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with those definitions, or do the words mean something different to you? And also let me know any broken mechanics that you've seen in previous editions of 40k. I'm sure we could do another video on that at some point. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the 40k stuff coming, with new videos coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying listening quite regularly, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is how I can afford to make all this content quite so frequently. If you are watching a lot, any support is enormously appreciated, and the link's down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.